Good morning, everybody. It is 9 o'clock, and we are going to try to honor your time during our workshop today. I am Corey Hill. I work at the Partnership for People with Disabilities at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I oversee the Virginia Early Intervention Professional Development Center. We are delighted to welcome you to our second workshop that we just started. It's called ElevatED EI. Today, we're going to be talking about supporting children, families, and caregivers using the pyramid model framework. I am delighted to welcome Naomi Grinney, who is going to be our presenter today. Behind the scenes, we have my colleague Seth, who will be helping. If you have any tech problems, feel free to drop questions in chat. He'll be monitoring. I also will be monitoring chat along the way. And I also want to welcome Ann Breger from the State Infant and Toddler Connection, who has been instrumental in helping us pull this together too. So, welcome everybody. And Naomi, I'm going to go off camera and turn this over to you.
Thank you so much, Corey. Good morning, everybody. I'm so excited. This is going to be an awesome morning. I'm so thankful for all of you joining and participating with us today. I am super passionate about the pyramid model framework. I think you might hear some of that passion as we kind of go through our morning. But just to give kind of a couple of quick things before we start. So we're going to be spending the next 3 hours together. We do have some breaks built in. You can, of course, feel free to take a break at any time that you need. Please make sure that you're taking care of yourself this morning. If you need to stand up, if you need to stretch, if you need to walk around the room. Some of the things that we are going to talk about might feel a little bit more overwhelming. So if you need to, take off your headphones and take some deep breaths, do the things that you need to do to care for yourself today. This webinar is being recorded, and so everyone will have the opportunity to access the information. Again, we're condensing a lot of information into a short period of time, and so what we're really hoping is that this is kind of the starting point, that you're going to get a lot of great information today, but there's also going to be more to come. Kind of that the state is going to be giving us, and more information that's going to be out. So know that if you're kind of thinking like, oh, I was wondering about that particular thing that Naomi said, you will be able to go back and access the webinar. We do ask that everybody stay muted. If you have a question, you can feel free to unmute. You can also pop your questions in the chat. I'll try and answer as many of them as possible. And I can always follow up with individuals later on, and kind of we can chat offline after the webinar as well. So we're going to get started. We're going to talk a little bit first about our learning objectives today, and also for maybe benefit purposes. If you see anything that is abbreviated in early intervention, we love our abbreviations, but you might have seen Pyramid Model Framework, or you might have seen PMF. So just wanted to let you know those are the same. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so our learning objectives today we're going to talk about some of the barriers that we see in coaching. Many of us use that coaching model. So we're going to talk about some of those barriers to coaching. We're also going to talk about the benefits of screening tools in identifying social emotional concerns. And we're also really going to be spending a lot of time on these core concepts of social emotional development. We're also going to understand the components of the pyramid model and how the pyramid model really is a framework for the work that we do in early intervention. We're going to talk about when a child's team might need additional supports and kind of how we can recognize that. And we're also going to talk about some ways that we can support caregivers who have experienced mental health challenges, stress, grief, trauma. The key practices You might have seen these in some of the materials that have been
When I get working.
distributed, in some of our emails that have come out. But really, as many of us know, Virginia has chosen the pyramid model framework as part of our state systemic improvement plan, or SSIP. Um, it's really what we're really focused on in Virginia is the effort to support children's social emotional concerns and being able to put resources in place for families and for kids. So when we look at kind of these key practices, social emotional development, family centered coaching, this webinar is really going to address and support all of these key practices and principles. Okay. So now we're going to get into it and talking about this pyramid model. So many of you have seen the pyramid model, and what it kind of looks like, but just to kind of take a minute to talk about what we're really looking at. Here is this framework, right? So this is not a treatment plan. This is not a kind of a rigid, behavior plan for families, but it's really the framework for how we understand social emotional development and the needs of children and families. And so what I really want to kind of take a minute to look at is this bottom layer of the pyramid, right? And when we think about a pyramid, we think about that triangle shape, right? And the pyramid is supported at the bottom by the effective workforce. And that's all of us, right? Going out and doing this work with kids and families. There are lots of things that we are doing in our day-to-day jobs, right? We are teaming with our colleagues. We are working on multidisciplinary teams. We are helping families getting connected to community resources and supports. But we also know that as adults, we learn best when we're able to relate what we're learning to what we already know. And so for many of us today, a lot of this that we're talking about is going to be reinforcing your knowledge, right? Some of you might be really familiar with the pyramid model. Some of you, this might be new information, but everybody is going to have this opportunity to really gain some new knowledge. When we learn, we kind of expand the tools in our toolbox, right? And so this is going to give us some additional resources, some additional information, some new ways of thinking about the work that we do. We also learn best as adults when we actively participate and practice what we're learning. And so we're going to be able to take the information that we learned today and apply it immediately. We're going to have this opportunity to think about kids and families that we're working with, teams that we're working on. And we want to also be able to provide some new learning opportunities. So we're going to not only kind of reinforce the knowledge that we have, but we're also going to expand our knowledge. Many of you are watching this and kind of participating in this webinar together with people on your teams. And so that's a great way for you all to begin thinking about, what does this look like in our system? What does this look like with the kids and families that we serve, right? Because even if we think about the state of Virginia, we're a really diverse state. We have lots of different early intervention systems. There are so many of us that are part of this workforce. And so it's really an opportunity for us to practice and participate in this learning journey and expanding our knowledge. Okay. So the pyramid model, what we understand about the pyramid model is it's this framework for understanding what's needed for all kids and families to be able to receive the supports and services that are most beneficial for them. Our goal is for many, many families to be in this kind of blue area of the pyramid, right? We're going to talk about this blue area as promotion, the green area is prevention, the orange area is intervention. And when we talk, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about promotion here first. And that's really what we want for all kids, right? And for all families is when we focus a lot on kind of our promotion efforts, we find that there are fewer kids that need prevention and intervention, right? And so that's what we're really talking about. And this can also be something that you think about for yourself, right? So when we think about kind of our own selves, if we spend the time doing what we know, our bodies and our spirits need, it we don't spend as much time kind of having to recover, right? So you think about those things, like maybe it's going for a walk, right? And it's like, oh, if I can go for a walk or just spend, 5 minutes outside every day, then, when we get that opportunity by, Friday, we're kind of like, okay, I've spent some good time outside, right? As opposed to being all the way to Friday and like, I got to get in all those 30 minutes, right? And so think about this for ourselves too, right? We're going to talk a lot about kids and families, but some of these principles can also apply to ourselves. All right. So we're going to talk. This is again, this area of the pyramid is called promotion, and really what we want is for every kiddo and every family that are in our systems, for us to really kind of emphasize this with families, for us to model this in our work, because this is really where we see a lot of change happen. Right? We see change happen in the context of relationships. We see change happen in the context of environments. We move up the pyramid and we talk about those prevention efforts. So that's going to be kind of the second part of our webinar, is talking about prevention. And then we'll spend the last part of our time today talking about intervention. So when we think about the pyramid model, some of you might be familiar with kind of Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And really what this looks at is kind of the way that families have their needs met. So we think about, for example, if we have a family that comes into our program and we're talking to them about, their child's goals, right? And this is a family that might be facing food insecurity or housing instability, and their physiological needs are not being met or are not being met well. And then we are, talking to them about something kind of up at the top of this hierarchy, right? So we're talking to them about, developing independence, being able to get connected with, their community. If that bottom of the pyramid or bottom of this hierarchy is not met, it's going to be much more difficult for families to kind of meet us at the top, right? And so when we're thinking about, what are the needs of these kids and families that are coming into our program, caregivers, keeping this in mind can be really critical, because sometimes, we'll say, oh, I went to this session at daycare and, the caregivers just really weren't paying attention. They didn't seem engaged, right? And then we think, oh, those caregivers are actually really overwhelmed. They've got so many children in their classroom. They're trying to meet the needs of everybody that's in there, right? And it just gives us a little bit of a different perspective for understanding where they're coming from. Or if we've got a family and maybe, they are in a place where they don't feel safe, right? And that's true. I know for a lot of families in our community right now, they don't feel safe. And, when we're talking to them about, how they can help support their child's development, it's not that they don't want to do that, but those feelings of safety have to be met first. And so sometimes that means that we're adjusting our expectations for what a family might be able to handle or manage, right? How they might show up in a session. Problem solving is at the very, very top of this hierarchy. And sometimes that's where we face challenges with parents and caregivers, right? Is engaging in that problem solving. But again, we think about everything that has to happen for them to be available for problem solving and engaging in that way. We also want to think about, even when we don't know exactly what might be happening with a family, we can hear from families, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling overwhelmed, right? And we can kind of empathize with that and we can understand what that might feel like for them. Okay. So this just kind of ties in those things that we were just talking about. We want in our effective workforce, we have systems in place. We're using evidence-based practices. When we think about those nurturing and responsive relationships, that's parents and caregivers who understand their child's development, who are in tune with their child's needs. Those high quality early childhood environments, sometimes people think of that as a daycare setting. And that might be true, but that also is the child's home setting. That's the child's community. That's wherever that child is engaged during their day. We think about some of those systemic approaches when we kind of move up in to prevention, to teach some of those social skills, right? To teach parents some skills, to teach kids some skills. And then we go into that prevention area and we're really looking at, what are some maybe tools that we can use? We might have some more support plans that are in place. Um, so just kind of keep these visuals that Seth so beautifully created for us in mind as we're talking about the pyramid. Okay, so when we think about kind of this area of promotion, what we're really looking at is understanding the impact of social emotional challenges. We're looking at building family capacity, and this is really kind of universal supports, right? What we're putting into place for all kids, for all families, how we're kind of designing our systems and our structure. So when we say universal promotion, what we mean by that is we talk so much, and you're going to hear me talk so much about these nurturing and responsive relationships. And the reason for that is because so often what I hear is, families that will talk to me about, concerns for behavior, concerns for their child's social emotional development. And what I'm doing often is kind of sharing this information with parents, right? What does social emotional development? How does social emotional development happen in the context of relationships? We're talking about these social emotional milestones routinely as part of development, right? When we think about early intervention, it's not, our PT and our OT and our developmental services and our, speech services kind of over here. And then, over here is social emotional development. Everything is happening together, right? So social emotional development isn't kind of an afterthought or something that's happening on the side. It's a really integral part of a child's development. And it's really important for parents to know that. Um, we also want to think about, how we are supporting these high quality environments. We're going to talk a lot about predictability and why that's so important for kids when they're developing their social skills in attachment, in their temperament styles, right? Predictability is really key. And oftentimes, when kids kind of are in those environments that are predictable for them, some of those challenges that they experience decrease really significantly. Um, we're also thinking about the ways that we're using, our IFSPs to look at kind of those ongoing supports that kids need. We're kind of assessing their goals. We're looking at their development. And so that's why we spend a lot of time kind of talking about this idea of promotion. Both of these are essential. High quality environments, nurturing and responsive relationships, really essential for not only for social emotional development, but this really depends on our partnership with families and our ability to kind of build those relationships. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, so I'm curious to hear from y'all. What are some strategies that you use to build relationships with families, childcare providers, individuals that you're working with? So just think about that. If you want to pop some of those ideas in the chat, think about those things that you're doing, what those kind of strategies are that you are using for building relationships. When we think about building relationships, a lot of times, kind of the core components of building a relationship is trust, right? Understanding kind of a parent perspective on development, being able to know what the adult learning style is, right? Recognizing some of those barriers. But really, so much of what we do with families is we develop trust, right? And that's something that when we think about, like in our system, I think about, we are going into families' homes. And I don't know about any of y'all, but sometimes when I know that someone's coming to my house, I try and clean as if no one lives here, right? I have 4 small children. People for sure live here. But it can feel overwhelming. Someone's coming to your house and you kind of want to have this, everything's together, right? And you guys are putting some great things in the chat, right? Not judgmental. We're actively listening. We're checking in with them about how they're feeling, asking about their experiences, right? These are fantastic things that y'all are doing. And that's really so many of these things are really critical for building that relationship. Um, and really developing that trust with families. When we have that trust with families, there's so much more that they're kind of open to. And it can feel tough, right? Sometimes we go in and we've got this IFSP and we've got these goals that we're working toward, but we have that opportunity, even just asking, how's your day going? Right? What's been happening this week? Um, yes, emphasizing that while we might be the expert in our field, they're the expert on their child, right? And sometimes, we're also really flexible, right? Sometimes we go in and the way that we think about, what's going to happen in a session is not what is actually happening, right? My daughter was in early intervention, and I very vividly remember several sessions with our PT where she would come and we'd have this whole plan, and my daughter wasn't having any of it, right? She was like, nope, not what I'm doing today. And my RPT was so able to kind of be flexible. And I really appreciated that as a parent, because in my mind, I was thinking, oh no, she doesn't want to engage, right? But we were able to kind of find other things that we could do and other ways that we could support and kind of participate in that session. Okay, you guys are putting some amazing things in the chat. Thank you so much. Okay, so one thing that's really critical to understand is this idea of family systems and how they work. So, family systems is a theory that views families as emotional systems that are made up of interconnected individuals. So, it suggests that individuals can't be understood in isolation from their family. So, a lot of times we see kids in the context of their development within their families, right? So we're not kind of looking at these kiddos in isolation. We're not looking at them kind of on their own. We're thinking about these relationships with their family members, with their communities, with their caregivers. When people are a little bit older, when we kind of talk about family systems theory, we're also thinking about how family relationships influence and impact emotions and behaviors. And so we know that, right? We know that, again, when we think about that predictability, right? People learn really early on about ways that they are kind of responded to and engaged with within their families. And so this is really kind of the theory that we talk about often. And as a clinician, like I operate out of this idea of how this family system works together, right? What are the kind of family rules? What are some of the family values and priorities? And so that's something to kind of just keep in mind is what does this family system look like, and how are these individuals relating to and engaging with one another? Okay. So we also think about these ways that we support, right? So many of you were putting in the chat these ways that we support social emotional development. So we are helping kind of build that parent buy-in, right? We're helping to ask questions. We are trying to learn more about what's happening. We're also kind of checking in with what parents understand about development, right? Because sometimes what parents understand about development, they might be thinking about their own experience, and maybe what they remember is when they were 5 or 6 or 7, right? They may not remember what was happening when they were 2. And so helping to maybe adjust their expectations a bit or reframe what they might be thinking. We also might talk to parents about what change looks like, right? Sometimes we think change happens so quickly, and change is a process, right? And so we might want to think about, and talk to parents about what is that change? How do we support change happening, right? How do parents engage in that change process? And so there's lots of ways. You guys are putting these amazing things into the chat. We're thinking about how we're listening to and responding to parents. We're thinking about how we're building that capacity of parents and caregivers. And these are all things that we're doing to support social emotional development. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of these core components of social emotional development. And I'll put them here for you guys on the screen. So what we're really kind of one of the biggest components of social emotional development is this ability to understand and manage emotions. And this is not just true in early childhood. This is a life skill. Where we are up in Northern Virginia, I see many people, adults, who have challenges with this life skill, right? I see them often when I'm driving on 495. They are not practicing their management of emotions, right? And this is something that can be really challenging for individuals. But we think about, the ways that that can look with small children. We think about elementary school children, we think about high school children, we think about adults, right? This capacity to be able to manage our emotions is so critical. And so we really also want to think about the family's culture, the community that they're involved with, the way that they connect and interact with each other, right? Babies and kids are born wired to connect. That's what they're doing. And so we want to think about what these kind of components look like throughout development, identifying feeling words, building skills, developing empathy. All of these are really, really significant when we think about these core components of social emotional development. Those predictable interactions, how your sense of self develops, right? We have this capacity to develop trust, to develop self awareness, to build our autonomy. All of this is happening as a result of our social emotional development. Okay. So again, when we talk about like why social emotional development is important, it's because it really encompasses a large range of skills. And these are not just skills that we see, excuse me, in social emotional development, but they're skills that we see in play, in movement, right? And lots of these early developmental areas. All of these kind of skills and developmental milestones, attachment, regulation, behavior, are impacted by social emotional development. Okay, now we're going to watch a real quick video that just kind of highlights a little bit of the way that we engage kind of with our parents, with our caregivers, and the impact that the parent and child relationship has. And Seth is going to share his screen so we can play this video. Thank you, Seth. I'm going to reshare my screen, so it'll just take me a quick minute. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about, some of you might have been familiar with the still face experiment. And that was done kind of a while back. It was one that looked at a parent without a cell phone. It was before the age of cell phones. Um, but it was really thinking about those ways that we engage with our kids. And so it was a mom, and she had her high chair. She had a kiddo in a high chair, and she uh, was kind of the same thing that was happening. This kiddo was trying to kind of gain her attention, and she was super responsive at the beginning, right? And then what happened was she then kind of was directed to the next time the child was trying to access her attention to kind of not respond with her facial expression. And when she did that, her kiddo became really distressed. And so what we kind of see in this video is that that same thing is happening, right? Where this mom is, kind of very, or caregiver is very responsive. And then when she kind of gets a little bit distracted, her kiddo experiences that distress, right? And this is such a short clip, but it's kind of indicative of the way that this happens sometimes, right? Where we have a lot going on or we're not paying attention, but we see that way that kiddo is kind of affected, right? When it's harder for us to maybe be paying attention, especially with really young children, right? That baby's pretty small. And even kind of being small, they're recognizing the way that their parent is a little bit distracted. And so, that's just kind of something for us to think about as we're talking about, these next few slides. All right, y'all, we're coming back into sharing. Okay. Thank you, Seth, for helping out with that video. Okay. So when we think about some of these kind of ways that atypical social emotional development might look, we're thinking about things like self-regulation. We're thinking about attachment relationships, temperament mismatches, behavior, right? What it can look like at different ages, and how that kind of really impacts an individual over their lifespan. So it can, when we think about self-regulation or interpersonal relationships, those are, again, these skills that we're continuing to build, right? We're in relationships with other people all the time. And so if we, aren't able to develop kind of those interpersonal skills with someone else, that can feel really challenging. It can feel really overwhelming. Our affect can be impacted, our reactivity. So, we know that kiddos that have these kind of stronger social emotional skills can tolerate frustration, that are, engaged in kind of less destructive behaviors. And so when we think about, typical social emotional development, we also want to think about what can atypical social emotional development look like. And we see that pretty often in our system, right? We see kiddos that are coming in with these kind of atypical social emotional developmental patterns. And sometimes, they're in conjunction with another, diagnosis or another delay. And sometimes they're kind of on their own, right? Where we're seeing that there are these challenges with social emotional development. And so these are some of the factors, right, that can prevent social emotional development from occurring. Families that are experiencing multiple stressors, strained relationships between parents and children, children who have experienced abuse and neglect, children with some, impact on their cognitive development. All of these things can be present. Sometimes multiple challenges might be present within one family. And so we really want to be thinking about not only what kind of we're looking for in terms of kids developing skills, but what are some of the impacts that can prevent social emotional development from happening the way that we would expect with young children. Okay. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because it's so important. So when we talk about emotional co-regulation, what is happening is that the caregiver is helping a child to develop their self-regulation skills. So at the beginning, when babies are really little, they don't have the skills to soothe themselves. And so they are reliant and dependent on an adult to do that for them. This is really critical because it happens when an adult has an appropriate understanding of what a child needs, right? And sometimes that does not happen. Sometimes an adult might say, oh, I can't believe they're crying again. They're crying to make me upset, right? When kids are small, crying is the way that they express everything, right? All of their needs are typically expressed through crying or distress of some kind, right? And so at the beginning, the caregiver is really the one that's putting forth that effort. That is, picking up a child, holding the child, snuggling the child. When you have a parent that is overwhelmed, doing those things can feel more challenging, right? And over time, the interactions become more balanced. And so, as a child develops some of those regulation skills, they don't need as much support from the parent, but especially in the beginning, they need a lot of that support. And so when we have caregivers that are consistent in their responses, what that demonstrates is that emotional distress is manageable, right? All of us are going to experience emotional distress at some point in our lives. It's just a fact of being a human on planet Earth. And so, what we want is not to kind of send kids out with no skills and kind of, okay, hope you figure it out, right? But we want to teach them how to manage those feelings of discomfort. And those are often skills that are learned, right? Because a kiddo, when they're kind of first new in the world, they don't have those skills yet. Um, Even how we're responding, right? That video where we were looking at the parent's facial expression, body language, tone of voice. All of those are ways that we kind of demonstrate these emotional co-regulation skills. Um, and it's something that can feel really challenging for a lot of caregivers, right? And so this is, I mean, I could talk about emotional co-regulation all day long. We only have 3 hours today, but kind of understanding what is happening from the very beginning, right? Day one of life, emotional co-regulation is happening. And children, even small babies, are learning based on the response of their caregivers. Some of the challenges that can happen with emotional, kind of the development of emotional co-regulation when a parent is experiencing stress, right? And oftentimes having a new baby in your home is stressful, right? They don't come with a handbook that you leave the hospital and they're like, do you have a car seat? It's like, yes. And also, what else do I do with this tiny person, right? And even if you have a parent that has maybe parented other children, every child is very unique, their needs are very unique, their development is very unique. And so each child can add a different layer to a family dynamic, right? So if a parent is really stressed, their ability to respond is going to decrease. Parents sometimes attach negative meaning to emotions that are typical for their children to express. When parents attach that negative meaning, they respond in a different way than when they're understanding what's happening. We also know that from birth, right? Babies kind of learn who they are by how they're treated. Children cannot regulate on their own, and they need that response from their caregivers. As kids get a little bit older, when we think about toddlers, we want them to express their emotions, right? But when you are a parent or a caregiver and your child is really like leaned into that phase where they say no to a lot of things or they say, I do it, right? It can feel really challenging to remember we're helping to develop these emotional co-regulation skills. And that's what we want for kids, right? We want for toddlers to kind of begin to develop that self-awareness. But it can happen where it feels really, really challenging for the adults in their lives. This is the period of time also in toddlerhood where I hear a lot of parents talking about that their child is trying to emotionally manipulate them. Manipulation is not a skill that develops until kids are closer to 5 years old. And so if you are working in the birth to 3 population, 0% of the children in your population are manipulating their parents or caregivers. Exactly 0%. And so we want to really help parents and caregivers to understand that children are actually developing these really successful strategies that are going to serve them well later on, right? Also, sometimes what happens is if a child escalates, and the parent escalates, there's a little bit of a volcanic effect, right? Where everything kind of blows over. And so really helping parents to be able to kind of tap into those skills that they need to be able to calm is really key. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about parent coaching. When we talk about parent coaching, I hear this all the time. We're talking about this idea of building a therapeutic relationship with parents. You do not have to be a therapist to build a therapeutic relationship. All of us have the capacity to do that. All of us have the skills to do that. We're talking about those things that we were sharing earlier: listening, responsivity, extending empathy. Think about those relationships that you've built in your life, right? With your friends, with your family members, with your significant others, with your children, with your community. Those are skills that you have extended to build those relationships, right? When you're listening to a friend who's sharing about challenges that they're experiencing, you are building that therapeutic relationship. And so, when you hear that phrase, just know that that's true of all of us, right? When we are in this role, we're building those therapeutic relationships. But we know that sometimes coaching parents can feel really challenging, right? There are barriers to coaching. We can have parents that have, a different idea about kind of parenting styles, right? We can have parents who don't know maybe a lot about child development. We might have parents that are resistant to the coaching model, right? They might be more used to a medical model or a different type of kind of coaching interaction style. And so, what we want to think about is, what are we doing to kind of build that engagement, right? Because it can be really tough when we're going in and we're talking to parents and we're asking questions, or we're, exploring ideas or strategies we can use, and we're kind of sensing that resistance, right? Or we're sensing some of those barriers. And sometimes those might be kind of really readily present for us, right? And sometimes they might be kind of underneath the surface. And so we really want to think about, what are those ways that we're trying to work through some of those barriers. We're supporting those parents. And again, we talk about this concept of like a therapeutic sense of self, right? The therapeutic use of self. And what that means is we're kind of taking in, the information that the parent is sharing with us. We're kind of combining that with what we know, with maybe some of our own lived experience. And all of those things together impact the way that we show up, right? And the way that we're present for family sessions and for interactions that we have with kids and families in our system. And so really thinking about that way that you're using your own knowledge, skills, right? To build this therapeutic relationship and have these therapeutic interactions with kids and families. Okay. So this next screen, I'm just going to tell you, is a video. We will make sure that this video is available in the sense of, or interest of time. We're not going to show this video, but it's a beautiful highlight. This is one of the providers in our Northern Virginia system. And it's a beautiful way that we can kind of see this parent coaching relationship develop, right? And so we're going to put the link here for y'all. You can go and watch this video. But again, thinking about these ways that we use coaching to be able to build and develop a therapeutic relationship. Okay. A little bit higher. It did start to play, but we're gonna keep going. Because this next area, two things. One, I want to be mindful of everyone's time today, but also I really want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time talking about the impact of stress, because sometimes we use that word, oh, we're stressed. Oh, we're stressed. Has anybody ever played the who's more stressed out game? Anybody ever played that with people in their life, where you ask someone like how they're doing, and they talk to you about how stressed out they feel, and then you talk to them about how stressed out you feel, and then you just kind of walk away from that conversation, right? We talk about stress all the time, and we talk about the way that it impacts us and the way that it impacts families. But we also kind of want to break that down a little bit. So stress is really a chain reaction. When someone experiences a stressful event, there is kind of an impact on the amygdala, which is the area of the brain that contributes to emotional processing. And so the amygdala sends this kind of distress signal into the hypothalamus. And that area of the brain is kind of like the command center, right? Your hypothalamus is kind of communicates with the rest of the body. And so then, what happens often is your body goes into this kind of fight or flight response. Um, those are fight or flight can include some outward physical responses, like you might your skin might start to perspire, you might your body movements might change, but it can also have some impact internally. Your heart rate increases, your senses become heightened, you might breathe differently, so your oxygen intake and output might change. And so what happens is like your cortisol levels rise to kind of manage the stressful event, and then they decrease, right? What can happen when stress is continual, right? Or when it feels kind of unrelenting is your body remains in this heightened state. And that is not beneficial, right? It's beneficial for a short period of time. That kind of stress response is a protective response, but our bodies are not designed to stay in that state. They are designed to kind of navigate through that stress and then kind of return to baseline. And so when we see families that are experiencing kind of this chronic stress, what can happen is that a body starts to make more cortisol. And then high levels of cortisol impact the functioning of the brain, impacts the functioning of the body. And if you look at like brain MRIs of individuals who have experienced a significant amount of stress, the shape and kind of structure of their brain changes, right? And so it's not something that's small. It's not kind of this, oh yeah, we're experiencing stress, right? For some individuals, that high level of stress really has a significant impact. And we also think about, everybody has the kind of different access to resources, access to support, right? And so two people might experience the same kind of stressful event and may have vastly different responses, right? And vastly different ways that they kind of navigate through that stress. And so that's something that's also really important to keep in mind when we're working with kids and families is the way that this stress can really have an impact. When we look at the words on this screen, some of these are things that we're going to talk about, right? Grief. We're going to talk about pain and sorrow and kind of what that looks like. But we're also talking about ways that it can really have that impact kind of on that, individual, the individual in the context of that family. And so stress can be, it's something that's really important to kind of keep in mind. And there's lots of things that also, we can look at kind of individual events, community events, global events. All of those are impacting kind of kids and families in different ways as well. It's also important to recognize that sometimes stress can be healthy, right? When you know that you're going to present a webinar, right? And you know what day and time that webinar is happening. Sometimes there's some healthy stress with that, right? All right, we're presenting, we got to get this, these slides ready. It can be motivating. It can be, it can help us kind of work toward this goal, right? When stress is predictable, when it's time limited, and when the kind of stress feels within our control, that's when it's healthy, right? That's when it can be kind of having this more positive effect. When stress is unpredictable, when it's ongoing, when multiple stressful events are happening simultaneously, it can become overwhelming and it can even be debilitating, right? So headaches, an increase in anxiety, muscle tension, stomach challenges, all of those can result when stress feels really overwhelming. Acute stress can also be kind of this immediate reaction to something that's happening, and chronic stress is something that's more ongoing, right? So thinking about all, we use this word stress, but really what that looks like and how that impacts families has a pretty significant amount to do with kind of how they show up and the interactions that we have with them. Okay, so these are some strategies that we can use to kind of support social emotional development, right? When parents have that responsivity, when they can demonstrate kind of affection and nurturing for their children, when we help children, right? When parents are responsive, kids feel safe and secure. We can help kids to understand and have words for the emotions that they're experiencing. And we can also explain like why these limits are in place, right? And we can help kids to understand why these boundaries exist, right? One thing that I learned a little bit later is that boundaries really help kids feel safe, right? If you think about, like, if a kid was going to go cross the street and they didn't know where the street was, it would be really hard for them to know how to navigate that street safely because they don't know where it is, don't know where it starts, don't know where it stops, right? It changes, it moves. And so it's kind of the same when we think about a boundary, right? When kids kind of know we cannot put our hands on the stove, right? That's a consistent boundary that we have. It helps them to have that and develop that sense of safety. Okay. So thinking about all of these strategies that we've talked about to support social emotional development, feel free to pop into the chat an idea of one thing that you might plan to incorporate into practice. So whether that's a way that we understand kind of kiddos and their needs, but thinking about that way that we're incorporating those ideas into practice. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about family culture. Culture is an essential component of a child's identity. Each kiddo is born and babies are born into a unique family that has its own culture, its own history, its own strengths, its own way of coping with stress and with adversity. Children learn in the context of their family culture, communication, social behaviors, emotions, and how they display emotions, what messages are received and acted upon. And so, even if you're working with a family and you think, oh, we have the same culture, right? We look the same, we have the same belief systems, what have you. Every single family has their own unique family culture. And that's really important to understand because so much of family culture is going to drive the way that kids develop, right? Understanding culture is a lifelong process. Culture happen, kind of understanding that culture, understanding what's important to families, what works for families happens in the context of relationships. It requires trust to be developed. It requires that you have that self-awareness and ongoing communication, right, with a family. Culture is also complex and multifaceted. And so, what we want to kind of commit to as professionals is an ongoing awareness, not only of ourselves, but also of others, that we are open and responsive to learning about other cultural perspectives, that we have conversations about what's important, right, for families and for kids. And culture also really helps to shape kind of the way that we view the world. Okay. So when we think about culture, right, what are some things that we often think of? We might think about, a way that a family, the foods they eat, their religion, the music that they listen to, celebrations that they attend. But culture includes so much more than that. It is body language, leadership, community engagement, who makes decisions, how emotions are expressed, behaviors that are acceptable and kind of embraced, right? How adults and children interact with each other, what independent skills look like. And so, we think about all of these kind of components of culture, and it's really, really important for us to have that awareness all the time when we're working with kids and families. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we are going to go into some breakout rooms, which I know is everybody's favorite thing to do, but it's really fun. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of wrap up our tier 1 or our promotion kind of information that was shared. And so what we're going to think about in our breakout rooms, and we're going to give you guys about 6-7 minutes in your breakout room, is to think about what is one takeaway or key idea that you'll consider in your work with families when we're thinking about these kind of concepts of promotion. So what's something that, like, tomorrow morning, if you have a session with a family, what's something that you'll be thinking about? Seth is going to put you into breakout rooms, and he's also going to explain how we're going to write down the ideas that you share in your breakout rooms onto a Padlet link. Okay, so we are going to talk now about prevention. And when we're talking about prevention, what we are talking about is not only kind of these responsive relationships and what that looks like, but we're really thinking about how we're kind of enhancing the family's capacity, right? So, prevention strategies and supports address the needs of children and families who are at risk for developing some more of these kind of intensive social emotional challenges. We're also looking at interventions and measures that might be used for kind of monitoring progress. And, thinking about when we were talking about, how we develop those therapeutic relationships for families, I want you all to also think about this idea of a parallel process. And so oftentimes when we're coming into the home, we're kind of serving as that model, right? We are responding to kids in this really kind of engaging way, right? And so we might be modeling something for a parent or a caregiver that they've never seen before. And so, we're serving as kind of that model for them, which then allows them to learn those strategies to engage differently with their kiddos, right? We teach that to grandparents, to siblings, to caregivers, to providers, right? We are kind of serving as that model. And what we want is for parents and caregivers to have the support that they need to then be able to support their children's development, right? That's kind of our goal in the work that we do in early intervention. Okay. So we are going to talk now about kind of two really significant concepts, temperament and attachment. And the reason that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about these two areas is because so much of the kind of challenge that we see in parents and children and kind of the relationships they build come back to these two areas. And so I really want you to think about, kiddos and families that you work with, the way that temperament impacts these parent and child relationships. And kind of the ways that we help to support parents understanding their kiddos' temperament as well. Okay, so there are three temperament types. There are kiddos who are described as easy or flexible. Sorry, advanced my slide too quickly. There are kiddos that are described as active or feisty, and there are kiddos that get described as kind of slow to warm up or cautious. So you can see here on the screen kind of the ways that each of those individual kind of temperament types, the percentages of kiddos who are those temperament types. And then about 35% of kids are a combination. So they're not necessarily kind of one specific type of temperament that we identify, but it's a combination. So, when we think about kind of those temperament types, we have, kiddos that have some level of intensity with several different temperament traits, but one that usually dominates. And so when we're looking at, maybe you have a kiddo that sometimes is slow to warm up or cautious, but tends to be, largely easy or flexible, that's the way we're going to describe that child's temperament. And as we go, it'd be really helpful, I think, for all of us to also consider our own temperament types, because we are, in kind of addition to, how we're thinking about kids, we're also thinking about kind of our own temperament style and our own temperament type. So we're going to talk through each of these, and we're going to kind of think a little bit more about each kind of kiddos that fit into these different types of temperament. Okay. So easy or flexible kiddos. These are kiddos these are kind of some of the characteristics or the traits that we often think about. We think about those kiddos that can kind of go with the flow, right? They're kiddos that adapt to new situations and environments. These are kids that, for example, might have a new caregiver in their daycare center, and they adapt easily to that, right? They kind of are able to still go and interact with that new caregiver. They're responsive to that new caregiver. And sometimes we think like, oh, we want all kids to have this easier, flexible temperament type, right? But what can happen sometimes is because of this kind of easier style, children may not be as expressive with what they need. right? They may not talk about the things that are frustrating to them or hurtful to them. And we want that, right? We want to be intentional in our communication with kiddos because we want to know what they're thinking and what they're feeling. We want to know what's going on with them, right? We want maybe for sometimes that they get frustrated, right? Because we want them to not to be able to be aware of and express their own needs, right? um have you ever been in a conversation with two easier flexible adults when you're talking about going to dinner? That conversation looks like this. Where do you want to go? Wherever you want to go. Where do you want to go? I'm open to anything, right? What happens is like you never decide on where you're going to go for dinner because everybody's just kind of open to the perspective of others, right? In that kind of situation, it could be really helpful if someone said, I want to go eat tacos, right? Because then maybe we kind of move toward a dinner plan. And so we want people to express what they want or what they feel, right? Even if they're in that mode of I could eat wherever, we still want them to have that ability to kind of let us know what they need. It's also important to kind of set aside some time to really be one-on-one, right? When you've got a kiddo that's really able to kind of engage in these social and group settings, you want that one-on-one time to kind of understand what they're thinking and feeling. Okay, these active or feisty kiddos, these kiddos have such a special place in my heart. I parent some of them. So these are kiddos that might have some differences in kind of their routines, right? They might have some differences in their kind of self regulation. They may have some stronger responses and reactions, right? They are kiddos that oftentimes you can see our little friend here on the screen looks like they're running and with a truck. Right. And so they want to be able to play in these really kind of big ways, right? That can be really beneficial to them to provide those play opportunities where they can move their bodies, right? They can engage with their sensory systems. Another way that we can kind of support these kiddos is helping to prepare them for activity changes, right? Helping them to know when something is going to be different, helping them to feel support when there's new in their routine, right? It's really important to also think about there's not a right or a wrong temperament, right? There's just who we are as people. And so, that same kind of concept is true for kids. There's not a better or worse or right or wrong. This is just kind of who kids are. And so it's not about changing who they are. It's about understanding who they are and supporting what they need, right? Because all of us are going to have different needs. And that's kind of can feel really challenging sometimes in parent and child interactions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, so they slow to warm up kiddos. These are kiddos that tend to feel more overwhelmed in a new situation. They might be a little bit, more quiet when they're coming into a situation. So these are kiddos that really love a routine. They really love, getting to know people. These might be the kiddos that when you're going to a social event, that they want to kind of sit and observe first, right? When you go to the playground, when you go to the library story time, they might want to just kind of see what it's about before they engage, right? And so, sometimes that can feel challenging because maybe a parent wants their kiddo to engage right away, right? So these are kind of kiddos though that after they've had a lot of kind of exposure or they've had a lot of opportunities, right? You think about a child starting daycare, and at first they're really cautious, they might be really quiet. After they get to know their teachers, after they get to know their friends, each day becomes a little bit easier, right? That environment is known, the people in that environment are familiar, some of the routines are really consistent, right? And so it becomes easier over time. Okay, so now I'm going to ask y'all to kind of use your stamp or annotate feature and just put like a stamp. Where would your kind of temperament style be? If you thought about these temperament styles, like where do you think that you would be in each of these areas? Would you be more easy or flexible? Would you be more active or feisty? All right, I'm loving these stars and hearts. All right, we've got some slow to warm up and cautious, I see. All right, so this is kind of the way that when we think about our kind of our own temperament, right? So when we think about, say, for example, doing a home visit, we think about our own temperament. We think about the temperament of the parent or caregiver that we're working with. We also think about the child's temperament, right? So that's a lot to consider in, say, a given home visit. Um, yes, if you cannot find the stamp feature or if it's being challenging, feel free to drop a comment in the chat. Um, that's always available. Okay. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for all of your stamps. I love the hearts and the stars and the check marks. Those are fantastic. Okay. So here's what we'll do is talking about kind of parent temperament, right? So when we think about the temperaments of kids and kind of what that looks like, we also know that parent temperament is kind of playing a role in that parent and child interaction. And so temperament is multidimensional. It is not your personality. Sometimes people confuse the two. Temperament is not personality. But we also know that these environmental factors can impact temperament as well. Um, so temperament has kind of been studied and researched and looked at for long periods of time. Um, and we know that when kind of a parent might have a different temperament style than their child, right? Again, we think about how that impacts the relationship. If you've got a parent whose temperament style is really easy or flexible and their child is real active, right? It can feel hard to know how do we support that, right? How does a parent understand what their child needs? And the ask is not that a parent changes their temperament, right? That would be really difficult, probably impossible to do. And the ask is not that the child changes their temperament. What kind of we want to see is that the parent understands what their child needs. So if you've got a parent and their preference is like, I would love to just sit on the couch, right? And their child is like, I would love to jump on the couch. Neither of those is problematic. What can be problematic is if there's misunderstanding. And so we want to help parents. Okay, if your preference is to sit on the couch and you know that you have a really active kiddo, what are some ways that are appropriate for them to be active? Right. I don't know, for those of you that parent or work with children, if you've ever told a child to like stop jumping, right? What do they tend to do? Jump harder, jump more, right? Bounce higher. And so rather than telling kids like, stop doing this, let's let them know what they can do. Let's provide them with some of those options, right? And helping parents to recognize, it's okay. Yes, I love that. Teaching your 2-year-old, oh, look, this is what mommy might need. This is what daddy needs, right? Help grandma out. It's a great game to play. So fun. So thinking about those ways that we can kind of adapt a little bit. And again, that ask is often for parents to adapt, not to change, but to adapt a bit so that they are able to help support their child. And over time, kids learn those skills for themselves, right? But it requires that parent modeling and that parent ability to kind of put forth the effort to teach their child those skills. Okay. So what are some things that you guys think? You can pop your answers in the chat. When there's a mismatch between a parent and a child. So when you have a parent and a child who have really different temperament styles, or a caregiver and a child, what do you think are some things that can happen? Stress, absolutely. Frustration, conflict, misunderstanding. Yeah. So it can be really challenging in the relationship, right? Because we may not understand each other. We may have a hard time recognizing what the other person needs, how we can help support, meeting those milestones. And so it's really important for us to kind of be in tune with that, right? To be able to recognize how a mismatch could impact that parent-child relationship, because it can, right? And what we want is, again, there's a lot that we're kind of hoping that parents are able to do. We're hoping that parents are able to have kind of the emotional capacity to meet their child's needs. We're hoping that a parent is able to kind of calm their emotional system, right, in order to be responsive to their child. And so this is something that happens over time. And so we really want to be able to support how a parent understands what their child needs and providing those ways that that child can get their needs met, right? Okay, so those are some things that we're kind of thinking about when we're thinking about temperament. Okay, so we also know that parents can feel overwhelmed, and it can be challenging for them to kind of be in tune with their child's behavior. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later on as well, because mismatches in temperament sometimes show up in behavior. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about temperament and kind of built some understanding about what that looks like, we are going to talk about what many of you were putting in the chat, the impact that attachment has on kiddos, right? So what do we think about when we talk about attachment, right? And we're thinking about kind of what that looks like in parent and child dynamics. So something to just kind of keep in your mind, right? Is, in addition to temperament, really wanting to have this understanding of what attachment looks like. So for those of you that don't know, attachment theory was actually developed in 1969, and it's a model that attempts to describe the dynamics of long-term interpersonal relationships. And attachment theory kind of addresses these really specific facets of relationships and how human beings respond when they're hurt, when they perceive a threat, when they are separated from their loved ones. Developing kind of secure attachment depends on a person's ability to develop trust. So we see the way that developing trust is really critical across kind of the developmental lifespan, right? The way that temperament plays a role in attachment, your life experience, early attachment styles also help to predict patterns of behavior in adulthood, right? And so when we talk about these attachment styles, we're not just looking at what's happening with young children, but we recognize that the importance of developing that secure attachment really has that impact across lifespan. So there's also kind of 4 distinguishing characteristics of attachment. And that is, those are proximity maintenance, so the desire to kind of be near people that we're attached to, having a safe haven or a secure base to return to, and kind of with that safe haven. So the safe haven is like you return to your attachment figure when you kind of feel the need for comfort or safety. But that secure base is like the attachment figure acts as that base of security for you. And then we also think about the ways that individuals respond when they separate, right? So when they are apart from their attachment figure, the way that they manage and kind of cope with those emotions. For people, and you'll see this kind of same concept a little bit later on today, the development of an attachment relationship with one primary caregiver, right? So we think about all the caregivers and kind of adults in a child's life. One secure attachment can really kind of set the trajectory for a kiddo in terms of the way that they develop attachment with others, and what that looks like kind of throughout their lifespan. Attachment is a motivational and behavioral system. It directs the child to seek that proximity maintenance with others, and to feel safe and secure when they get overwhelmed. Okay. So when we think about kind of these different attachment styles, we're going to kind of talk through each of them. But attachment can also be impacted by, birth trauma, severe kind of medical challenges, pain, prenatal stress, temperament mismatches, right? So all of those things can impact attachment. Attachment is also something that we could talk about all day long, right? Because it's such a significant part of what's happening in development. Okay. So we think about this secure attachment style, and this is kind of what we want for all people, right? We want them to feel these things that you see on the screen. We want for kids to feel safe and secure. This type of attachment happens when parents and caregivers are available and sensitive and responsive and accepting, right? Predictability is super important with attachment. Um, Research suggests that around 66% of the US adult population has a secure attachment style. 66% is not a great percentage. So we'd really like to see some changes with that, right? Kids that have this secure attachment style, they're frequently kind of visually and proximally checking in with their caregivers. They are settled by their caregivers' attempts to soothe them. They have a clear kind of approach to their caregiver, an expectation of comfort by that caregiver. The child feels safe to explore and interact with strangers when their caregiver is present. So that's what we want to see for kids, right? That their kind of physiological systems are calm, that they're able to engage in learning, and they're open to kind of experiencing and exploring new things. So then when we think about this anxious attachment style, so these are some of these characteristics that y'all will see on the screen. Some of the less common risk factors that are associated with this anxious attachment style are physical and psychological abuse and early separation from the primary caregiver. About 19% of adults have this style of interaction in their relationships. They don't really have a response to separation, right? They don't kind of pay attention to when a caregiver's coming and going. They often have kind of an internal high arousal level. So they may look like they are angry, or they might look like they're attempting to control, and it's really a way that they're managing those anxious feelings. They might avoid eye contact or verbal interaction. You might also see for individuals that experience anxiety, sometimes they engage in this kind of what can seem like purposeless activity. So you might see them like rolling a truck back and forth on the floor, and it's an attempt to kind of calm their physiological system, right? And so kind of thinking about what that can look like for kids, and the way that anxiety, if any of you have ever experienced anxiety, it can feel really overwhelming, right? And it may be that your anxiety is kind of situational, but it may be that anxiety kind of is present all the time. And so when we think about this way that we feel anxious in a relationship, right? Where we don't know what to expect. We don't know how someone's going to react or respond. It can feel really unsettling when you're a young child in particular. Okay. So this next style that we talk about is avoidant. It's also called avoidant insecure. These kind of characteristics of kiddos or of parents who have kiddos with this avoidant style, are parents who minimize feelings, do not help kids to build their skills or kind of navigate challenges. So what happens is kids kind of shut down their feelings, and they have this sense of like I don't need anybody, right? I can do it myself. And that's not a way that we want people to feel, right? We kind of operate even as adults in the context of these relationships in our lives. And so we don't want for kids to kind of be taking on emotional ownership for everything, right? We also want for kids to, we want them to be able to be soothed. Kids that have this avoidant style, they're not able to be soothed by their caregiver. They experience a lot of anxiety around that interaction. About 23% of the US adult population has this attachment style. And we really want for kids to, again, when kids are kind of avoiding their feelings, they're not in tune with what they need, right? They're not able to express that need to others. And so it's really kind of key to be thinking about these ways that attachment impacts and influences, relationships, interactions, social environments, kind of keeping this in mind. And then this last style that we're going to talk about is this disorganized style of attachment. These are, this is the most kind of extreme, and it's also the least common. Um, so these are individuals that have kind of a clear lack of attachment behavior. They are increasingly vulnerable to be impacted by stress. They have a lot of difficulty with self-regulation. Um, their actions and responses to caregivers are a big kind of mix of behavior. And this is the kind of attachment style that's a really uh, significant predictor of psychopathology later on in life, often onset by age 17. So you can see that it's a later onset in teenage years, but it's, when you think about the lifespan, you see that impact, right? 17 is not that old. And so you see that impact really happening in kind of a critical place in adolescence. Um, in this kind of style, a kiddo can feel kind of comforted and frightened by a parent. And that's very confusing, right? When you feel that way. And so, again, one of the things that we can do is we're not here to kind of diagnose, right? But we're here to kind of recognize and be able to support what might be going on in a relationship, right? And it's okay, even for me, right? When I go into a visit and a parent shares something in a session, the expectation is not that I'm going to kind of fix everything, right? The expectation is not that I'm going to provide a diagnosis. It's that I can listen and be empathetic and be responsive, right? And those are things that we can do with parents. And we can also talk to them about ways that they can engage with their kiddos. And so these are some of the strategies, right, that we can help support parents in developing. One of the things that we can do, we talk about this a lot, is we kind of hold the child in mind, right? We hold the child and their experiences and their perspective when we are kind of parenting and when we're providing care for children. So when we think about, our tone of voice, our body language, right? All of those things impact kind of our attunement and engagement. Providing comfort when kids are upset, how we, many parents are developing attachments with their children that are very different from the attachment style that they were raised with. And that is super challenging to do when you are parenting, right? Like if you could just say to your child, like, hang on, I got to work out my attachment styles, be back with you, right? But that's not what's happening. You are parenting and caregiving as you're trying to navigate through this, right? And you might even, as a parent, be recognizing the way that your attachment styles were not secure in your own life, right? Or you might be able to see that when a parent is sharing information with you or when a caregiver is talking to you about their experience. And so really help, being able to understand there's a significant impact that attachment has on relationships, right? And we can be reflective with parents. We can be reflective of their parenting strengths and challenges. We say this all the time in early intervention. Every single family has strengths, right? Even recognizing, I'd like to develop a different attachment style with my child. That's huge, right? That's a huge strength that a family has. Every parent comes in with their own history, their own relationships, their own experiences. That impacts how they interpret their child's behavior. And we can also, serve as a resource and as a support. Okay, so one of the other ways that we can support these parent and child interactions is we can write social emotional goals. We are going to learn a lot more about this as a state. There's going to be a lot more information that's shared. There are already some webinars and some resources out there. If you're kind of thinking like, oh, writing goals, that feels overwhelming for me, it's okay, right? It can be overwhelming. But I just want to talk for a minute about like what these social emotional goals are. So we think about like what is being taught, right? We think about how, social emotional goals are just like goals that we would write to support any other area of development, right? It's like writing PT goals, right? It's like writing OT goals. And these are, some of these skills that we think about with social emotional goals: managing conflict, how we're making friends, self-regulation. As kids are getting a little bit older, right? We're not looking at like 1 year olds having impulse control, but that's happening as we get closer to kids leaving our program. And so we can also think about those foundational steps, right? One of the other things we're going to learn a lot about in the state of Virginia is thinking about, how we write goals kind of for the family. So we'll be talking about that a little bit too. Some of the challenges of writing social emotional goals are, behavior, kind of the function of behavior is really complex. We don't, even when we could ask a kiddo, like, why did you do that? Right? The answer might be the sky is blue, right? Their response may not be the actual reason, right? Sometimes they don't know the reason. Um, there isn't always a capacity for change, right? So sometimes we're like, oh, this needs to change. Sometimes that capacity does not exist. Sometimes we have parents that don't know what should be happening in development, right? They may not be as responsive to learning. And so these are things that, sometimes we may not have, right? Especially when we're getting to know a family, kind of an initial assessment, we don't have the full picture of what's going on within that family, right? And sometimes there are kind of limitations to, like I think about a daycare environment, right? There may not be an ability to change, right? Some of those structures and kind of programs that are in place. Also for adults, right? Oftentimes I hear parents tell me like, oh, if my child would just do this differently, right? I just want them to make the change. Change also happens in the context of that parent and child relationship, right? So it's not like a 2 year old is going to wake up and one day be like, here's how I'm approaching the world differently, right? It happens as they're learning and developing and in those kind of relationships, right? And so that can feel really overwhelming sometimes for people when they're thinking about how that change is happening. Okay, so we're going to talk really quickly about these kind of components of social emotional goals. If you've done goal training or have written goals before, these are goals that we use. These are kind of the components of goals in early intervention, right? We want goals to be functional. We want to kind of increase that child's social emotional ability. We want to think about how their behaviors might be impacting their daily routines. We want the skills to be generalized, right? It's great if a child can use their skills at home. We want them to be able to also use their skills in the community. We want for kids to be able to we want for skills to be able to be taught in a way that reflects the environments that kids are in, right? We want skills to be able to be measurable, and we want them to be participation based, right? So we want the skill to be able to be used and kind of seen. We also want for skills to be able to happen like within their routines and activities, right? It's really important also to think about that there's a difference between our goals and what we might want and what a family's goals are, right? So sometimes I know this has happened to me where a parent comes in and, I'm seeing maybe some language impacts. I'm also seeing some motor impacts, and the family just says, we just really want them to walk, right? And in my head, I'm thinking, oh, let's, maybe write some language goals. That's not what the family is concerned about, right? And we can talk with them about what we observe, but ultimately we need to be thinking about what are those family goals. And we're going to be learning so much more about family goals and kind of what that looks like across our state. But we really just want to be kind of keeping that in mind, right? Is that there is a difference between those two. And then when we think about participation, right, we want kids to be engaged in kind of this process of writing goals, right? We are not writing, of being able to engage with the goals that we write for them, right? We want to kind of think about the context in which these social emotional skills might be needed or where they might be important. We are definitely going to be learning more. There's a whole, we talked about our state systemic improvement plan, or SSIP. There's a whole work group that is focused on writing family goals, right? But we know that goals can be written to support atypical social emotional development. And what we want is to focus on those strategies for prevention and promotion, right? Or promotion and prevention. So that's what we're really kind of focusing on when we think about how we're developing these goals. We also, think about all of those pieces that we talked about: attachment, temperament, stress, co-regulation, right? Those are components of goals as well. So please stay tuned for more about how we're going to be writing these goals. The other thing to keep in mind is that we can use screening tools, right? These are just kind of some of the examples, but we want to know that screening tools exist. We can use the tools that are appropriate to the child's development. Tools can be a helpful way to kind of have a discussion, right? Or put something on paper to kind of say, here's what we're seeing, right? The Part C office is going to be providing so much more detail and information about screening tools and resources that are out there. Some of y'all might be using some of these screening tools and resources already in your systems, but there are recommendations and requirements that are going to be coming out in the next few years as part of the state systemic improvement plan. So this is just kind of a quick way to be a reminder that we are going to learn more about this, but that we can also utilize the tools that exist to help support the goals that we write for kids and families. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about a friend. And then in our breakout rooms, y'all are going to have the opportunity to practice writing some goals together. Okay, we're not grading anybody's goals. There's not any right or wrong answers here. This is just an opportunity to think about how we're writing some goals. So we're going to talk a little bit about our friend Cassie. Cassie is a very adorable 8-month-old kiddo. The family priority is for her to play and interact, to call her parents by name, right? And when we think about calling her parents, right, that's beneficial for two reasons. One, that for Cassie to know kind of that she can, right? She can call her mom and dad and they can be responsive to her. And also for her parents, right? To be able to know, oh, she's calling me. There's something that she might need. There's something that I might be able to do, right? And so we see the way that some of these kind of priorities can have benefits for both that parent and for that child, reducing some of that frustration they might experience in their relationship. So these are some things that mom reports is that, Cassie doesn't really laugh or smile. Mom described her as being really quiet. She's content when you kind of put her on the floor for long periods of time, sometimes with minimal interaction. Cassie also doesn't really seek out her sister to watch her or engage with her. She makes great eye contact when she feels comfortable. And she's not really kind of doing a lot of movement in her play yet. Mom also described Cassie as being more quiet. She spends a lot of her day kind of observing, and she's not really engaging vocally, and she's not really making kind of those ooh or ah sounds. Mom also said that she's noticed that Cassie hasn't really paid attention to her hands and feet. When she's on the ground, she's staying pretty still. And she also has a really identifiable cry that she uses when someone unfamiliar is holding her. So mom feels like her kind of temperament style is a little bit more kind of a combination of like active and feisty in terms of like that feistiness in her response. She's also a little bit more kind of slow to warm up or cautious with new people. Okay, so when we kind of practice this with our team, we talked about some of these goals that we wanted, that mom had identified and family had identified. And what we were really focused on is this kind of play with familiar people, right? And everything that we were writing was kind of taking into context and taking into account, Cassie's temperament, her attachment. And so when we were thinking about play, we were really thinking about who are those people that are familiar, comfortable for her, right? How we can reduce some of that frustration where Cassie is trying to communicate what she might need. Parents might not be understanding that communication, right? And also those opportunities for seeking social interaction, again, with those people that are very familiar to her and very consistent responders for her. And so these were the goals that we developed on our team. And we talked about that she would request to play with mom and sister. So we were looking at our long term, right? When she was coming in, she was 8 months. And so we were looking at that full year, right? And what she would be doing, so that she would request to play with her mom and her sister using some single words, so that they would know, what is she interested in playing with, what's kind of engaging for her, right? And then we talked about some of our short term, right? That she would be responsive to her name, but that she would also be calling other people, right? So there could be a little bit of that reciprocity with kind of engaging and responding. We also talked about some play and how she would initiate some of that play. And we then talked about kind of those social, right? Sometimes when we think about some of those social interactions, like we want kids to do a lot of verbal expression, right? Hi, bye. But even being able to wave, right? Give a high five, blow a kiss, right? Those are ways that for kiddos that may not feel as comfortable expressing themselves verbally, or may not have that skill yet, that there are other skills that we can kind of draw upon, right? And so this was our kind of example for what we were doing with Cassie, some of the ways that we were helping to support Cassie's social development, her social relationships, her engagement and responsivity, not only hers, but her family's responsivity to her. So what we're going to do now is we're going to practice. So you are going to be put back into breakout rooms. They may be the same, they may be different. And what we're going to do is we're going to give two different examples. So you'll see one of kind of two examples in your breakout room, and then you guys will practice together writing a goal. All right, everybody, welcome back. I hope that few quick minutes was restorative for you. Thank you for kind of being here and being present for this webinar today. We're so appreciative of everybody joining with us and being here. So this last area that we're going to talk about is intervention. And like I've talked about, we're going to get a lot more information from the state about writing behavior plans and some of these more intensive interventions that we're using. But what I really want to talk about today are some of the reasons why we might see kind of kiddos that are needing these intensive interventions, right? Some of the challenges within families, some of the challenges that individuals are experiencing. And so we're really kind of remembering, the family is considered the expert on the child, and the family really plays that crucial and critical role in planning and in support. Partnering with families is evidence-based. We talk about how, we might be developing some of those replacement and responsive strategies. And we're really looking at enhancing that family capacity. So sometimes when we think about intervention, we think about behavior. And so that's something that we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about today, because I know it can feel really challenging for when you're working with kiddos and families. So using your stamp feature or your annotate feature again, I'm curious, what are some of the challenging behaviors that you see in kind of your work with kids and families? These are some of maybe the common ones. If there's other ones that you see, put those in the chat. You can stamp multiple places too. It doesn't just have to be one area. So I'm seeing stamps happening in all of these areas. Lots of stars and check marks and hearts and X's. So yeah, I think that even just with all of you guys who have stamped so far, right, this is really indicative of the challenges, right, that we see when we're working with kids and families. And there are probably some that aren't even listed here, right? Feeding concerns, safety concerns, kind of body space concerns, right? All of those are things that can show up for sure. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about behavior. And when we think about behavior, a lot of times what we're talking about is the duration and the intensity and the frequency, right? So when we the definition of challenging behavior is behavior that's happening with such an intensity or frequency or duration that the physical safety of the person or others is placed into jeopardy, or behavior which is likely to limit or deny access to the use of some community settings, right? So, we have parents that will say like, oh my gosh, my child was upset for an hour, right? Or they're upset throughout the day, right? Or their behavior is so intense, I just don't know what to do, right? And sometimes when we think about those behaviors, we're thinking about those physical behaviors, right? The hitting and the kicking. We're thinking about yelling, some of those verbal behaviors. We might think about, throwing or breaking something, some of that destruction. And behavior feels really overwhelming because oftentimes people don't feel like they have the tools to be able to manage it. They might not know where the behavior is coming from. They might not have kind of the appropriate understanding of what's developmentally happening, right, with a child. And so you think about something like biting, right? Biting is a very kind of age appropriate behavior. And sometimes, if a child bites and a parent might have this really big response, sometimes what the child is learning, right? They're not biting to be manipulative. They're biting because they figured out it elicits a really big response, right? And so they do it again because kids are not great at differentiating or understanding positive responses and more negative responses, right? They just see a response and they're like, yes, I'm going to do that again, right? And so what we know too is that kiddos, toddlers, have really big feelings, and they don't often have the skills for managing those feelings, right? Behavior has meaning. We talk about the ABCs of behavior. All behavior communicates, right? Even if we don't know where that behavior is coming from, behavior is a communication. And so when we have caregivers that are viewing behavior as manipulative or purposely hurtful, caregivers are more likely to respond out of anger or out of frustration. Behavior then escalates and can lead to further challenges with those interactions, right? When we can recognize that behavior is happening in the context of normal development, that caregiver response is more calm and they're more able to then teach effective tools, right? So adults also are sometimes still working on being aware of their own feelings and emotions, right? And being able to manage them appropriately. So imagine as an adult, right? You would feel frustrated when you were not understood. And kids can feel the same way, right? That kiddo that's like, oh, I just wanted to play with the truck. That is their focus, right? And they're not thinking about, well, how did I get the truck? Oh, I grabbed it from my friend, right? They were just focused on getting the truck. When we can recognize that, we can teach them, how do we ask for the truck? How do we take turns? Right. But it's really, really significant, kind of the meaning that is assigned to that child's behavior. We also have parents and caregivers that will sometimes pathologize behavior. I don't know about any of you, but I have had many parents in the course of my 11 plus years of early intervention that have asked me if their 2-year-olds are narcissists. And the answer to that question is no, they are not. They're just two, right? 2-year-olds do not have great reasoning skills. They do not have great impulse control skills. And so if you are attempting to reason with a 2-year-old, it's going to be a little bit frustrating, right? So we also know that it's really important for us to understand behavior, right? Irrational behavior is normal, right? 2-year-olds, especially very irrational people, 3-year-olds, very irrational people. It's because they're driven by their emotions, right? That logic part has not kicked in yet. Toddlers want to have a lot of control, right? And they're small, and so there's not a lot that they can control, right? What can toddlers control? They can control their eating, they can control their um, bowel movements, and they can control sleep to a certain extent, right? And so if those were the only 3 things you could control in your life, you'd probably want to take a whole lot of control in those areas, right? And that's what kids are doing. Toddlers are also, and young children are becoming aware that they're kind of separate beings from their parents. And so they want to kind of exert some of this control, right? Manipulation, when people talk about manipulation, oftentimes those strategies are actually really kind of successful to get what they might want or need, right? We might have to help shape how they're doing it, but that idea of there's something that I want, right? And I'm going to find a way to get it can be a really great life skill. Um, we also know that the part of the brain that controls emotions or actions, so thinking, planning, problem solving, remembering, right? That part of the brain is not developing, right? It doesn't start to develop until kids are closer to age 3. And what age do a lot of kids leave our programs if we're working in early intervention? That's right, 3, right? So some of these things that parents are expecting and caregivers are expecting of their kiddos are just not developmentally appropriate. Doesn't mean that they're not frustrating, though, right? And that's what we're helping to support. So these are some things that we can use, some kind of strategies that we can share with parents and caregivers, right? We talked about telling kids what we want them to do, giving them choices, giving them, validating the feeling, right? I know you want to be able to climb on the counter. I understand that, right? We can climb on the couch. We can climb on the stairs, right? That's where we can climb. Those are safe places for us to climb. It's not safe for us to climb on the counter, right? You can still set that boundary. We're not climbing on the counter while offering choices, right? And that's really important for parents to remember because oftentimes they think, oh, so that just means my child can do whatever they want. Absolutely not. That's not what that means, right? What it means though is you as the parent or caregiver are offering some options, right? Instead of just saying no or stop, that doesn't give a kid an idea of what they should do instead. So you're helping to kind of understand that. Okay. Also, just want to add a note here that, many of the kids that we work with are neurodiverse. And so some of the things that we're talking about, or, when we're talking about behavior or social interactions, the impact that neurodiversity has, and wanting to help parents be aware of that, right? When we're thinking about goals, if you've got a kiddo that does not make eye contact, right? We're not going to write a goal for them to make eye contact when we understand kind of the neurodiverse needs that they have. So really wanting to just kind of keep that in mind, how the kind of differences in brain functioning, the differences in learning style, and how we support that, right, as early intervention professionals. And so just wanting to kind of also for all of us to be keeping that in mind, and how we're kind of supporting kids and families. Okay. So this is kind of another question for you guys to think about. When parents are sharing some of those challenges with behavior, right? And they're talking about, behaviors that are overwhelming or frustrating or difficult for them. What are some strategies that you might share with them? What are some things that you talk to them about? What are some ways that you might encourage them, right? As you're thinking about that, feel free to pop your answers in the chat. But again, this is where we often talk about like this therapeutic relationship that we're building, right? This way that we're using ourselves, our experiences, our knowledge to be able to kind of empathize, relate, be responsive to parents. Okay. Co-regulation, absolutely. For those of you that are not maybe familiar, we have the Backpack Connection series, and these are great kind of tip sheets, as you will, or quick reference guides, right? To be able to, for a variety of different topics, taking turns, sharing those types of things, right? So if you have not checked out the Backpack Connection series, I would definitely encourage you to do so. It's really kind of packed full of great learning information. Okay. We are going to now spend some time talking about trauma. I realize that trauma can feel triggering for some, might elicit some of your own feelings and emotions. Please be taking care of yourself during this conversation. If you need to step away, if you need to take a moment, please do that. If it is something that is overwhelming for you to listen to, that's okay. This is recorded. You can always come back to it whenever you need to. We are going to do this very kind of quick conversation around trauma. This is not all inclusive, and there are so many more opportunities to build kind of your trauma knowledge. That often comes, right? Being able to build your own trauma knowledge comes when you've been able to navigate through trauma you might have experienced, right? And you might be in a different space, at a different time in your career or in your life. So please take care of yourself today while we talk about this, and recognize that there are more opportunities for learning. And really for, kind of why we talk about trauma is not only so that we can kind of understand it, but also so that we can kind of be trauma informed. For those of you that are kind of in different areas of Virginia, there are trauma networks that you can join with other individuals that want to kind of understand the impact of trauma on kids and families, who are kind of working together to be supportive of kids and families who have experienced trauma. Feel free to reach out to your local trauma network for support and resources. We have that in Fairfax County as well. But just know that this is kind of a very quick overview to give you some initial knowledge and awareness about trauma. But please, please do take some time to really think about how you might take time to learn more, because this is such an impact. Sarah, to answer your question, how you find a local trauma network, they're often kind of run and supported through your local like CSB or Department of Children and Families. If there is not a network in your direct area, oftentimes if there's one kind of in a larger area near you, they welcome members. So I know that that's true in Fairfax. We're always welcoming kind of individuals from other areas, but that's the kind of place to start. Okay. So we are going to talk now about, oops, I'm sorry, my slides went too quickly. So when we talk about trauma and we think about kind of types of trauma, these are the different ones. We kind of talk about these three, right? Acute, complex, and systemic. We know that kids are very, very impacted by the events that take place around them, even when they don't understand what they're seeing and hearing. Trauma has an impact. Especially when the trauma is impacting the individuals that kids rely on for safety and security. We also talk a lot about, when we think about trauma, we also talk about toxic stress. So those are those kind of constant, unrelenting negative experience that really take a toll on a child's growth and development. Parents and caregivers play a really significant role in helping infants and toddlers to develop resilience. We talked about with attachment, that kind of one stable and consistent caregiver. The same is true for trauma. When we think about the impact of trauma on kids, what we know is that one stable, consistent, responsive caregiver can really help to offset, right? It doesn't eliminate the trauma, but it helps to offset the impact of that trauma. So it's really kind of significant that kids have that really secure relationship with one parent or caregiver. We also know that there are a number of different trauma symptoms that can kind of be present, and those can include emotional, physical, behavioral, cognitive. There are lots of symptoms of kind of trauma. And so, when we think about a way a child might be presenting behaviorally, right? Some of that may be that we're looking at it through that trauma lens. And when we can do that, the behavior, we can understand the behavior, right? And there's a big difference between understanding a behavior and accepting a behavior, but it gives us an understanding of why this behavior is happening, and it allows us to change our response, right? And that's really, really key. Okay. Many of you might be familiar with the ACE study that was done. The ACE study was done by kind of a partnership with the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it's one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect and household challenges that were experienced in childhood and the impact that it has later in life. The original study was conducted between 1995 and 1997. There were over 17,000 Health Maintenance Organization, or HMO, members that participated in this study, completed confidential surveys regarding their childhood experiences, their current health status and behaviors. And what we know about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, is that they are common across all populations. In the study of 17,000, almost 2/3 of study participants reported having at least one. You can have an ACE score if you take the survey between 1 and 10. So 2/3 of the participants in this study reported at least one, and more than 1 in 5 reported 3 or more ACEs that they had experienced in their childhoods. Some populations we know are more vulnerable to experiencing adverse childhood experiences because of the social and economic conditions. in which they live and work and play. Um, the ACE score is also like it's the total. So when you'll see we have one that you could reference if you wanted to, if you were curious about learning more. There's lots of kind of videos out there about the Kaiser study, about ACEs. You could type that into Google. You'll get so many different results coming up. Um, so, these are, if you don't or haven't heard about ACEs, it's really, really kind of important knowledge for you to have. Um, this idea again of like toxic stress, when we have kiddos that are experiencing prolonged adverse stress, um, their kind of physiological system develops an unhealthy stress response. Behaviorally, they have unhealthy stress responses. And what can happen is like a weakened immune response, right? A weakened physiological system. And so, parents, again, like we talked about with so much of this work, parents are often parenting through their own trauma, right? Through their own history, their own experiences. Sometimes those are challenges that have been resolved, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're challenges that are being realized as you parent. Um, and so, parents might have that difficulty, right? Being able to be responsive to their child because they are so overwhelmed by what's happening to themselves, right? And it's hard. It's hard as a parent and as a caregiver to kind of reach out and ask for support. Sometimes we have this idea like, I'm a parenting island, right? I can do it all myself. I've got this. Um, and that's really a tough place to be, right? When you don't feel like you can have anyone that you go to or can lean on or rely on. And so, what we really want to be able to do is kind of have this opportunity for parents and for kids to feel like they can thrive, right? Okay. So we talked about ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. For those of you that might be familiar with Nadine Burke Harris, she wrote a great book. There's a book that, for those of you that are familiar with Oprah, she wrote a book that's called What Happened to You, right? Nadine Burke Harris wrote this book called The Deepest Well. And these are kind of a dive into, the impact that trauma really has on us. There's another great book that's called The Body Keeps the Score. So if you're interested in learning more, this is how you learn more. So these are the different types of ACEs: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, kind of including each of these subgroups. So those were the things that these researchers were looking at, right? Is the impact of these experiences in childhood and how they were impacting adults. Because what was happening is all these adults were coming in with, addictive behaviors, with really kind of chronic health conditions, and there was this question of like, why are these adults kind of presenting with all of these difficulties, right, and these challenges? And then when you look back at what they had experienced in childhood, these were some of kind of the common issues that were being faced. Okay. So we know that impact, the ACEs have a significant impact. As the number, like the higher your ACE score, the higher your risk for negative health outcomes, right? Early death, heart disease, right? Chronic stress, all of those impacts. And then the other thing that happens is you're more likely to engage in risky behavior, right? In behavior that does not maybe align with your value system. But even something like, missed work can be an indicator of, the way in which trauma is having this impact, right? And we look at these kind of physical and mental health symptoms as well, that can, have this really long lasting impact. So if you are interested in learning more, if you want to kind of, understand more about ACEs, this is the ACE quiz. We're not going to do it together today, but it is a way that you can kind of learn more about your own experience that might be helpful for you to talk with, as you're talking with parents and with families. In our area, a number of pediatrician offices actually use this as part of the questionnaires that they ask parents kind of in those first 5 years of kids' life. And so it's really kind of important to just again, be thinking about what this looks like. Um, okay. So, oftentimes when we talk about trauma, the kind of um, partner or companion to that is grief. And, it's again, understanding grief is really, really important because many families that are in our programs and in our systems have experienced grief. And oftentimes, that grief is that they are parenting a child whose development looks different than they expected, who has needs that were unanticipated, and they are adjusting to a lot of new information, right? And when you're, parenting or caregiving journey, when you kind of have this one way that you think it's going to happen, and then it goes in a completely different direction, it takes time to adjust. It takes time to process, right? Um, and so I really like this visual because this is kind of what we think tends to happen when we think about grief, right? Is that grief, we define that as the experience of coping with loss, right? And we're going to talk about some different kinds of grief, but it's also important to remember that we ourselves, right? We experience grief and we also support families who are experiencing grief. So when we do early intervention work, it's not like everything that's going on with us just gets put on hold, right? We're processing and experiencing our lives as we're supporting others. And so it's important to remember that like sometimes we might need to take a step away, right? We might need to think about how we're caring for ourselves. Because this is what we think kind of happens is that, oh, grief shrinks over time, right? And what actually happens is that we grow and we learn to adapt and kind of hold space for that grief, right? So it's not that it just disappears or we get over it, right? It's that we adapt over a period of time. So when we think about these, many of you might be familiar with kind of the five very common stages of grief, and these stages were developed by a psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in 1969. And what's really important to think about is that these stages are not linear. So it's not like you move from one to the other, right? And not everyone experiences every stage. And so, they don't have to happen in any particular order. Sometimes you might be in one stage and you find yourself in a different stage, right? Um, and so they're not a rigid framework either. They don't apply to everyone who's experiencing grief, but they're a little bit of a way to think about kind of how we understand what an individual might be experiencing, right? So there are different types of grief that we talk about. And we talk about anticipatory grief, which kind of involves grieving before the actual loss. So maybe when you learn that someone has a terminal illness, as an example. We talk about abbreviated grief, where maybe you move through kind of the grieving process more quickly, right? So maybe you've done a lot of that emotional work while you've been anticipating that loss, right? Some people also experience delayed grief. So you might not kind of feel that immediately after a loss, but you feel it weeks, months, years later. Sometimes when you experience shock, that also delays kind of your body's response, right? So your body is kind of responding to that shock, and there's that delayed process. Some people also experience inhibited grief, where they repress their emotions. Many of us as adults even have not been taught how to process or recognize some of those kind of multidimensional emotions that happen around grief. And so a lot of people end up repressing their emotions and they don't even realize they're doing it, right? Unfortunately, what happens when we repress those emotions, grief can also show up as those physical symptoms. right? So an upset stomach, insomnia, anxiety, panic attacks. Um, so that's why oftentimes we talk about kind of, embracing that grief, right? And sometimes, as people, we kind of feel most comfortable when we're like in a one emotion space, right? Like I feel happy, I feel sad, I feel frustrated, I feel overwhelmed, I feel joyful. Grief has a way of like bringing multiple emotions to the surface, and it can feel challenging to hold space for those. And so just recognizing that, you can feel more than one emotion at once, and that's okay. And there can be space for both. And there's not a right or wrong way to experience emotions. Um, there's not a right or wrong way to kind of navigate through, right? Your experience is your experience. Um, Cumulative grief tends to occur when there's multiple losses that occur at once. Um, so for parents, they might be, for parents that we work with, they might be kind of grieving the loss of kind of their parenting experience, the way they thought it might be. They might also be grieving, a child's ability, right? Or what they think that their child's ability is going to be. Oftentimes we see families in our program where marriages and partnerships are really strained because parents and caregivers are experiencing grief. And then we also think about collective grief, right? So we think about those major events, wars, natural disasters, school shooting, pandemics. Those really create these kind of far-reaching losses. They impact what we feel like are, those normal life events, right? And so recognizing that there's also this sense of collective grief that can occur. We also know that grief symptoms can be emotional, they can be physical, they can be behavioral. Sometimes with emotions, people describe that as like coming in waves. Emotions are kind of showing up without warning. You might find yourself laughing and then in tears, right? Grief causes people to feel the whole spectrum of emotions. You might experience emotions that feel confusing or conflicting. Um, uh, as an example, people talk about feeling sadness that maybe a loved one has passed away, and also feeling the sense of relief that they might not be experiencing pain any longer. Um, it's really essential to kind of recognize and be responsive to the emotions that we're feeling. With those physical symptoms, we think about fatigue, headaches, nausea, restlessness, upset stomach. Um, Behaviorally, it can be hard for us to kind of think or make decisions, difficulty focusing. So just being in tune with and aware, those are symptoms that you might see kind of for yourself. And those are symptoms that you might also see in families, right? And again, some people, in their kind of for parents and caregivers and their growing up experience, they were really taught to like embrace their feelings and emotions. They were really taught to like be responsive to those feelings. And some of those individuals were not taught those skills, right? They might have repressed their feelings. They might not have been in a space that was safe for them to express their feelings. They might have gotten ridiculed for expressing their feelings. And so we really want to think about, the impact that grief is having on our kids and families. Um, I worked with a parent, um, who was experiencing kind of multiple losses at a time. Um, and it took a long time before she was really able to say, I'm grieving. And, as we kind of talked about that a little bit more and got into that a little bit more, she had never really kind of learned how to grieve, right? And so it can feel really overwhelming. Like the way that she processed was just like, I'm good, I'm fine, everything's okay, right? I got this. Um, and it really took some time to just say, it's okay if you're not fine, right? That's okay. You don't have to be fine. Some people also see or have been taught, right, that when they express emotions or exhibit emotions, that's kind of a sign of weakness. That is not true. If you have heard that before, I'm here to dispel that myth. Um, Feelings and emotions are human nature, right? And so it's really, really significant and kind of critical for us to be in tune with and aware of those. So thinking about kind of when we move forward, and as we move forward from today, as we're getting into the last kind of bit of our time together. This video, we're not gonna play it today, but I would encourage you to go back. It's a TED talk and it talks about the different paths of grief. It's a short video, but it's really impactful and powerful. So I would encourage you to go back and watch. Um, but to think about, and if you feel comfortable, popping it into the chat, feel free to do that. Um, Thinking about, the work that we do, right? Sometimes, like we talked about a little bit earlier, you might be supporting a family that has also gone through an experience that's been similar to yours, right? Or a family's talking about something and it's bringing up these feelings and emotions for you. So, thinking about what are some things that you do to care for yourself, right? And the importance and significance of caring for yourself. What are some things that you might do moving forward? Maybe there are things that you haven't already done. Maybe there are things that you've wanted to do, but you just haven't incorporated quite yet. But what are some things that you kind of want to do to care for yourself and kind of be in tune with and aware of what's going on? Um, One thing that I know I've said in Fairfax often, great and wonderful as all of you are on this webinar today, and those of you who are going to listen in later, and valuable as the work that you do is, we are all, right? I'll use myself as an example. I am replaceable in my job, right? I am replaceable. I could leave my job tomorrow and someone else would come and fill in. I am not replaceable in my life, right? I'm just there's not someone else that could just step in and be the person that I am in my life. And so, if you haven't thought about it that way before, or maybe if you have, take those opportunities to think about what those coping strategies are that you use. Sometimes when we talk about self-care, does anyone ever have this happen where you're talking to someone about like how overwhelmed you are and they're like, have you done some self-care? Right? Like it's super simple to do that, or we just all have time for like lots of self-care. Um, Self-care doesn't always feel that easy, right? And the things that we do, that I might do for my own self-care don't work for someone else, right? So self-care is very individual. But it's important to be able to think about, what do I need in a day, right? In my house, I might have mentioned I have 4 young children. Self-care for me looks like drinking a cup of coffee that is hot from start to finish without using a microwave, right? Something really simple, but it can be hard to achieve in a morning, right? When everybody's going to school and getting ready for the day. And so everybody's kind of self-care is going to look different. Sometimes, for some people, self-care is routines, right? Self-care is having a conversation with someone. Self-care is driving in the car by yourself and having it be quiet, right? Self-care might be like screaming when you're by yourself in the car. But thinking about those ways, because it's so much easier, like we talked about with the pyramid model, it's so much easier when we are able to focus on for ourselves on what we need, right? That promotion, rather than to try to get support when we need an intervention, right? And it's so much easier to think about, what do I build into my day? And sometimes that might mean you're reaching out to a colleague or your supervisor to say, hey, here's what I need. Sometimes it might be taking a mental health day, right? Sometimes it might be switching jobs, right? There are all these different ways that we can care for ourselves. But if you walk away from this webinar with kind of learning nothing else, I hope that you're able to kind of hold on to this idea that caring for yourself is so critical, right? Has anyone ever heard this? When you tell someone that you work in early intervention, they're like, oh my gosh, you play with babies. That's so fun. That's so fun. Right? And I'm like, no, I'm thinking about the 18 monster trucks I had thrown at my head today. And, all of the kiddos that used my pants as their tissues, right? Sometimes it's not fun and play, right? We deal with some of those heavier pieces. We go into families' homes, right? We're engaged and involved in ways that are very, very personal. Um, and it's okay, right? It's okay when we can say to people like, yes, this is great work, it's important work, it's impactful work, right? But sometimes it's also heavy work. And that, when we can have awareness of that with one another, right? And when we can check in on one another, when we can talk about kind of those resources that exist for ourselves, right? um that is really key, right? To be able to continue to do this work. And all of us need that, right? Like, I don't know if anybody else does this, but I know sometimes when I'm driving to home visits or I'm out on the road, I'll like look around and be like, anyone else out doing early intervention home visits? Do I recognize anyone? Right. And I was driving to a different office one day, and I was driving kind of with other colleagues who were also in their cars. And all of a sudden I'm hearing like this honking noise. And I'm looking around like, what's going on? And I see a colleague driving by. She's like waving. I was like, oh, hello. And we got to our destination, and I was like, was something wrong? Like, why were you honking? And she said, no, I just know that whenever you're out on the road, you're always looking for other people. So I thought I'd say hi. But even something like that, right? Knowing, oh, it's so nice when you see someone else out that's doing this work. Because sometimes it feels like we're doing it kind of all by ourselves, but knowing that is a whole network, there's a whole group of people that are out that can kind of relate a little bit to what your experience has been. Okay. So to kind of wrap up, right? This is kind of such an important framework for all of us to understand kind of what this pyramid model looks like. And the reason why is because it's kind of almost like a pyramid approach, right? Our state has taken on our state systemic improvement plan, this SSIP, right? And they are giving us tools and resources, but that kind of the pyramid model is like the foundation, right? It's one of the frameworks that's so important for us to understand. There are going to be lots and lots of future learning opportunities, right? When we think about promotion and we think about how are we building, those responsive relationships, right? That might be just a conversation that you're now having in your system, right? What do those responsive relationships look like? What are we doing to kind of promote quality environments and responsive relationships for all kids, right? Thank you, Cora. That the state systemic improvement plan is a 6-year plan. So the reason why it's a very long plan is because we know it takes time, right, to shift. It takes time to learn, right? So it's the idea or the expectation is not like, oh, we're all going to get this, right? We're going to pivot immediately, but we're all on this learning journey together, right? And there's going to be lots and lots of opportunities for us to learn more together, to kind of grow our skill sets, right? But really thinking about, as you're walking away from today, thinking about those ideas or those thoughts that you might take back into your system, right? What are we doing with kind of promotion, prevention, and intervention? What does that look like in our system? What are the ways that we, all of the different ways, right? Because that's going to look differently in each system that we help to support kids and families. What do we understand about attachment and temperament? What do we know about trauma, right? How are we responsive to grief? And so these are opportunities that we all have to be able to kind of build that knowledge, build that skill set. But when we have that kind of shared perspective, right? When we have that shared kind of ability to understand the framework, it allows for us to have conversations that are intentional, where we're kind of using some similar language, where we have some shared ideas about what that might look like. And really, this helps to benefit not only all of us, right, in this base of the pyramid as the effective workforce, but it really has that impact on kids and families, right? And all of us have this capacity to be able to affect change. All of us have this capacity to develop therapeutic and responsive relationships. All of us have this capacity to care for ourselves. And so, thinking about kind of what we've talked about today, I'm hopeful that you all are, starting to generate some ideas like, what is this going to look like for me, right? How might I just changed my perspective? How might I be maybe responding differently to a family, right? How might I understand a family's needs differently? And so, I really just hope that this has been a time. I've so enjoyed this time spent with all of you. Thank you all for participating in breakout rooms. Thank you for sharing your ideas in the chat. Thank you for learning how to use stamp features. That might have been new for some of you today. Um, but really remembering that this is our learning journey that we've been on together. Also wanted to do a reminder that we are going to be sending resources. So please do kind of connect with those resources, look at your handouts. There are resources specific for each kind of tier. And there's always opportunities to be able to learn more. And then I will just, love this visual: promotion, prevention, intervention. You have your handouts, you're going to be getting those. And then also, please make sure that if you participated today, you check your inbox. That is where you will get information about taking the survey that will come for you. And then you'll be able to download your certificate that you attended and participated today. So that's kind of your next steps, is to make sure that you're kind of keeping an eye on your inbox. Also, I know this happens to me, make sure you're checking all of your inbox folders. Sometimes they go to fun places. And then I'm going to just put my contact information here on the last slide. If there are questions that we did not get to answer today, if there are kind of things you're wondering about, feel free to reach out. Even if I don't maybe know the answer or know what's happening in your particular system, I'm happy to kind of point you in the right direction or help if I can. But thank you guys so much. This has been such a fabulous way to spend the morning, and I'm just so appreciative of the time that we got to spend together.
Naomi, I want to take the opportunity. I see it's blowing up. People saying this was fabulous. If I had the opportunity, I would give you every cup of hot coffee from start to finish to thank you for. I think it's really important for folks to know the amount of time and effort that goes into a presenter doing a 3-hour workshop has been um, very extensive, and Naomi has just been so fabulous to work with. I want to hit a couple things, just housekeeping. I've messaged some of you, and I have your emails, Naomi, for a couple questions that we
Sure.
did not get to. But again, feel free to reach out if you have a burning question now. Naomi and I are happy to work with you. Um, to try to get those questions. As Naomi said, the Virginia Early Intervention Professional Development Team, we do have some folks from other states, so that's what we keep calling VEIPD. If you don't know us by that, has many different resources. Another workshop being discussed in collaboration with the State Part C office. This recording will be posted in the next couple days. Some people have asked if you are in a large group, whoever registered will get the link to the survey. It should be in your email box by the time you hang up today. Share that with your colleagues. The only way to get your certificate is to complete the survey. Um, let's see if I think, did anybody see anything else that I missed? I think I've hit everything, but I'll stay on for another minute or two if people have questions that I might not have caught fast enough during the chat. So again, thank you all, and I hope you all have a good rest of your afternoon. And Naomi, thank you.